I'm gonna go ahead and throw a trigger warning on this video because it has some unsettling themes that maybe not everyone is on board with. So if you're not interested in hearing about death, dying, or bodily harm, I would suggest swiping. So Cotard's delusion, or also called Cotard syndrome or walking corpse syndrome, is a delusion in which a person believes that they are dead, or they are dying, or they don't exist, or that their organs are putrefying, they're missing organs, they're missing blood, they're missing limbs. It's really grim and it's a horrible thing to experience. Basically, it's a delusion that's characterized by very, very strong denial of your own existence, denial of portions of your body, denial of certain body parts, and in a broader sense, a denial of the nature of the world around you. It prevents a person from making sense of the external world around them, and this causes a distorted image of what the world really is like. So their world might become very dull and flat and emotionless and kind of cut off from the rest of reality. Or you could believe that you were in hell because, you know, when you're dead, you could go to hell. And a lot of people also believe in that as their reality. People with Cotard's delusion can become very withdrawn, and they can neglect their personal hygiene and their personal physical health. They tend to withdraw from the people in their lives. They kind of like give up on taking care of their needs because they don't have needs when they're dead. My experience with Cotards has been multifaceted, and I've had a lot of varying kinds of that delusion. I thought I was dead a lot, and when I was dead, I believed that everyone around me was also dead. That's another way that you could experience it, is believing that not only are you dead, but everyone else is dead. And when I was dead, I was super depressed, and I felt no motivation to do anything in my life because I really didn't have to do things since I was dead. I also believed that I was dying, and I died many different kinds of deaths. I died by being on fire and burning to death. So I felt that experience of seeing myself covered in flames and actively dying, and then kind of accepting my fate, then being dead. I believed that I had been hanged. I believed that I had been poisoned. I believed that I had been buried alive. So I remember what it was like to have those thoughts of how you would feel before you die, of, oh my God, I'm dying, and then accepting my fate. It's a really scary thing to feel yourself dying. Oh God, it's like really enforced my fear of death. I also would at times be missing limbs. I would be missing my left arm, I would be missing my left leg, and even though I could use those limbs, I didn't believe that they were there. And I would say tuck my arm into my jacket and not use it. And it's so strange, but it's almost as if I could look and see it physically and not believe that it was real. Kind of like having a dead limb, like seeing this dead part of myself that was attached to my living body, and it was essentially rotting away. So that's been my experience with Cotard's delusion, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I wouldn't wish psychosis in general on anyone, but like particularly delusions like this. Delusions can be really violent. They can be very traumatizing. I carry a lot of trauma from delusions like this and others. So when people like don't understand what we're going through, this is just a taste of just how bad it can be. Psychosis doesn't necessarily have to be bad for everyone, but for some of us, it really is traumatizing. Excuse my incredibly American accent, but I want to tell you about an interesting phenomenon called folie à deux. Folie à deux, which means madness of two, is actually a shared delusion. It is also referred to as shared delusion disorder. This is a psychiatric condition in which a delusional belief is transmitted from one person to another or multiple people. It can be a folie à trois, folie à quatre, and from then on it can go all the way up to several people, including families. It is very involved, but we're just going to stick with the example of two people experiencing the same shared delusion. There are two varieties of shared delusions that are folie imposée and folie simultanée, which determine how the delusion is transmitted from one person to another. Folie imposée is where a dominant person who is experiencing a psychotic delusion imposes that delusion onto a secondary person, and the recipient typically would not be in a state where they would have this belief on their own. Usually when the two parties are hospitalized and separated, the secondary person who has the belief imposed upon them would come out of it on their own, not even necessarily needing medication because it wasn't really their belief to begin with. Then there's folie simultanée, which is when both parties are already delusional or have a predisposition for becoming delusional. And essentially, the two people who have these separate delusions would influence each other's delusions so that they would sync up and they would have identical delusions. This has happened to me, and I didn't even realize it because I guess I only knew about the first kind, the imposé, the folie imposé, right? So I was completely unaware until someone pointed this out to me. And thank you for pointing this out to me because now I actually have a better idea of how this works. First of all, with shared delusions, it tends to amplify the delusion in both people. I think this goes for both the imposé and simultané types because when you have a person confirming back to you that what you believe in is really happening, it can come across as evidence or proof, and that will just reinforce the delusion, making it harder to come out of. This is why I strongly stress to people who ask how to help their loved ones that you should not feed into delusions because that actually harms the person. And the more they go into that delusion, the more it just unravels, the symptoms become more heightened, it's harder to come out of it. It's just a mess. Also, another thing to consider is that while there is no known cause of shared delusions, there are contributing factors. These are stress and social isolation. I had agoraphobia and my world was very small. I had very few people in my life. Physically, the only person that would come to see me in my apartment was my mom. And so with only that social party to latch onto, I really only had her opinions to go off of and her beliefs to go off of and whatever news that she had to share. So it influenced my world without even going into a delusion. When you are socially isolated and you have very few people in your life, you tend to become dependent on the people in your life. And if that person is in an unstable state and they tend to have delusions, it's very easy to fall into their line of thinking. The most effective course of action in treating folie à deux is separation, hospitalization, medication. Basically, when these people are together, like I said, they're really strongly influencing each other's mental state. So when you pull them apart and you have them going on their different paths of treatment, it's a lot easier for them to come out of the delusions and be treated because it's so hard to get them to break out of that bubble. And once you do, it's possible to completely end the delusions. So there's a little peek at folie à deux and all that phenomenon entails. If you have any experience with shared delusions, I'd love to hear more. I know one person already shared with me about a shared group delusion that they had, and that was very fascinating. Whatever take you have on it, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Are there warning signs? If so, is it possible to notice and get medication before going too far in? Let's talk about it. There are absolutely warning signs of going into psychosis. They can be hard to catch unless you're familiar with psychosis. For me, I can now tell when I'm going into an episode because I've had so many. And around my fourth episode, I was able to identify symptoms as they were coming on. And yes, I was able to get on medication and have it treated and come out of an episode just before it got to be like a total break. The thing is, the early onset signs don't look like the kind of things you'd expect to see in psychosis. When people think of psychosis, they think of the positive symptoms of hallucinations and delusions and catatonia and paranoia and all that fun stuff that adds to your experience. But in early psychosis at the onset, there are negative symptoms that are displayed first, and the negative symptoms take away from your experience. So these look a lot more like depressive symptoms of withdrawing socially, performing poorly in work and school, not taking care of your hygiene, becoming apathetic, and just generally closing in on yourself. That's what you're really trying to look for. This initial onset is called the prodromal phase. There are 3 phases of psychosis, and it's kind of like a roller coaster. At the beginning, you have the prodromal phase, which is the base. And this is when the symptoms creep on slowly or quickly. It can take years or weeks. It's different for everyone. And it ramps up, the positive symptoms start, and you end up in the acute phase, where a person will have a break or at least be in the most heightened part of their psychosis. This is when the positive symptoms will really take over, and for a lot of people, they will lose awareness. And with most people, after getting on medication, you will kind of decline into the recovery phase, which is where you come out of it. So the prodromal phase, as I said, can take weeks or even years to come on. So you can absolutely catch it. It's just that it can be really gradual, and that's why it's so hard to tell. So if you or a loved one experience psychosis and you want to make sure that everything is okay and there won't be any episodes, be sure to look out for those negative symptoms. And look out for the positive symptoms of hallucinations and delusions too. But catching those negative symptoms is your best bet at intervening and cutting off a psychotic episode before it ends up in a break. You may have heard of sundowning in relation to Alzheimer's and dementia. This is a condition that commonly happens in the elderly community. It is essentially a state of confusion starting in the late afternoon and going into the night. It can cause a number of symptoms, including irritability, aggression, anxiety, restlessness, suspicion, mood swings, even hallucinations. It is always interesting to come across conditions or disorders, syndromes, what have you, that have psychotic symptoms that are not psychosis. Like I recently did an interview with my fiance about how he has hallucinations from borderline personality disorder. So it can be easy to mistake conditions that have these symptoms of hallucinations and paranoia for psychosis, but there are a few key differences. What I find most interesting about this disorder is that it's a lot like delirium, but it's not actually delirium, because delirium comes on suddenly and happens throughout the day. It comes and goes, whereas sundowning is practically scheduled because it has a start time, which is the late afternoon, and it goes throughout the night and it progresses throughout the night. And by morning, it is resolved just to start all over again. That, I think, is a key difference, because psychosis isn't like timed like that. Like psychosis can for some people be constant, and for other people it could be like delirium where it comes and goes, but the symptoms don't happen at the same time often. That, I think, is the biggest takeaway here. Nonetheless, psychotic symptoms of hallucinations and paranoia can be severe no matter what cause it is. You don't have to have psychosis to have an entirely valid experience with hallucinations and delusions. They can still be incredibly realistic and terrifying, very engaging. So that in itself is quite valid. Psychotic disorders and psychotic symptoms may not exactly be the same thing, but they have the same effects, which is why I think it's something to be taken seriously. People usually don't believe me when I tell them that it took several months to relearn how to talk because of my psychosis. And I get it. That sounds really outlandish. Like, that's not something that you just lose. Maybe if you had a traumatic brain injury, but how can a mental illness make you forget how to talk? Well, there's this funny little thing called negative symptoms. There are positive symptoms and negative symptoms of psychosis. The positive symptoms are what add to your mental illness, and the negative symptoms are what subtract from your mental illness. So something like not being able to talk anymore is actually a negative symptom of psychosis because it is essentially taken from you. This specific symptom is called alosia, which means poverty of speech. It is essentially when a person has a lack of language and they can't properly communicate. There's a disconnect within them that separates their ability to communicate language from their internal experience. So a person with alosia may have very long pauses between words when they speak, or they may only answer what is asked of them without elaborating. They may give short responses or one-word responses. They'll often have a flat tone in their voice and have dull facial expressions. And for some people, they may not even have any speech at all, and that will take some time to recover. When I had alosia, I could manage yes or no answers, and that was about it. I had a lot of trouble thinking and comprehending, so even just stopping to think about how to answer a yes or no question took a lot of thought. If someone asked me if I wanted to go out to eat, I would have to really stop and think hard about what that meant. And then I would come to determine that, yes, I did want to eat. So I'd say yes. And then if they'd ask, where do you want to eat? Or what do you want to eat? I would shut down mentally. I would have no answer because even if I had an idea of what sounded good at that time, there was no way I could communicate it. And this kind of came along with another symptom of psychosis, which I should probably look more into, and that's an absence of thought. And a lot of people don't believe me either when I say that, because how could you possibly not think? But it is possible that you could lose your thoughts and not have that ability anymore. So this, in combination with the alosia, made it incredibly difficult to communicate. Anyway, that is absolutely a valid symptom of psychosis, and it's not made up. It's not an exaggeration. It is completely possible to lose your ability to speak as a result of psychosis.